January 1945. As Allied armies pushed toward Germany from the west, a second front was already closing, quietly, legally, and almost invisibly, across Eastern Europe. It was not announced in speeches, it was not debated publicly, and it was not treated as a crisis inside Allied headquarters, but the pattern was there, clear enough for anyone willing to look. While the Western Allies measured success in miles advanced and cities liberated, the Soviet Union measured something else entirely: control. Not battlefield control, but political control, administrative control, security control, the kind that does not retreat when the shooting stops. This difference in objectives is where the story truly begins. By early 1945, Joseph Stalin no longer viewed the war as a race to Berlin alone. Berlin was inevitable. What mattered now was everything behind the Red Army's front lines. The territories being absorbed quietly, methodically, and irreversibly as Soviet forces advanced west. The Western Allies did not see this as a war. They saw it as coordination. Inside Allied command structures, especially SHAEF, Eastern Europe was treated as a future diplomatic issue, not an immediate operational one. Boundaries were lines on maps to be discussed later. Occupation zones were abstractions. Political systems were someone else's problem, deferred until Germany was defeated. Stalin did not defer. Every Red Army advance unit was followed closely by NKVD detachments, political officers, and security teams whose job had nothing to do with fighting Germans. Their task was stabilization, though not in the Western sense. They identified local leaders, resistance figures, pre-war officials, and anyone with independent influence. Within days, those individuals were either removed, co-opted, or eliminated from the political equation. This pattern repeated everywhere the Red Army went: Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia. The speed was the tell. Soviet military movements were fast. Soviet political consolidation was faster. And yet, inside Allied headquarters, this behavior was interpreted as temporary, an excess of wartime security, a byproduct of brutal occupation policies born from suffering on the Eastern Front, something that would be moderated once peace arrived. That assumption was fatal. The first signals were already coming in through intelligence channels, but they were not elevated. Reports from OSS contacts, diplomatic observers, and resistance groups described the same sequence again and again. Liberation followed by arrests, coalition governments hollowed out from within, security ministries handed to Moscow-aligned cadres. But these reports conflicted with Allied priorities. The overriding goal in early 1945 was unity. Keeping the alliance together until Germany surrendered was treated as more important than confronting what that alliance was producing on the ground. Every warning that suggested Stalin was using the war to expand permanently was reframed as speculation or dismissed as premature. The Allies were fighting a war they believed was ending. Stalin was fighting a war he believed was transforming. This disconnect widened with every week. At conferences and planning sessions, Allied leaders spoke about post-war elections, international guarantees, and transitional governments. Stalin spoke about security, borders, friendly regimes, buffer states. The words sounded compatible. The meanings were not. What made this especially dangerous was that Stalin's strategy did not require confrontation. It required patience. He did not need to violate agreements openly. He only needed to interpret them aggressively. Where Allied documents were vague, he moved. Where boundaries were undefined, he filled them. Where responsibility was deferred, he acted immediately. And the Allies allowed it, because nothing Stalin was doing, at first, technically broke the alliance. This is the core of the pattern most histories gloss over. Eastern Europe did not fall because the Allies were defeated. It fell because they waited. They waited for Germany to surrender before addressing political realities. They waited for conferences to settle boundaries already being enforced by soldiers. They waited for diplomacy to catch up to facts created by force. By the time Allied leaders realized what was happening, the conditions they needed to reverse it no longer existed. The Red Army was not just occupying Eastern Europe, it was embedding itself into its future. The pattern became impossible to ignore only in retrospect, but it was visible in real time to those paying attention. The question is not whether the Allies had information. They did. The question is why they did not act on it. The answer lies in fear, not of Stalin, but of fracture. Allied leadership feared that challenging Soviet behavior too early would collapse the coalition before Germany was defeated. They feared a diplomatic rupture more than a geopolitical loss. They believed the alliance itself was fragile enough that pressing Stalin might provoke consequences they could not manage. Stalin understood this fear and exploited it relentlessly. Every time the Western Allies hesitated to raise an issue, Stalin gained leverage. Every time they postponed a confrontation, Soviet administrators entrenched themselves deeper. Every pause became a gift. By the time Allied troops reached their final halt lines, Eastern Europe was already being reshaped from the inside out, and crucially, it was being done without starting a new war. This is what made it so effective. No dramatic invasion, no declaration. No moment the Allies could point to and say, "That is the breach." Just a steady conversion of battlefield presence into political permanence. This was the moment Eastern Europe was lost. Not in 1947, not with the Iron Curtain speech, not with later coups and purges, but while Allied armies were still advancing, and Allied leaders still believed the war's outcome could be negotiated later. The day the Allies let Eastern Europe fall was not a single date. It was a decision-making pattern. A pattern of delay, a pattern of deference, a pattern of believing the war would end cleanly. Stalin knew better. And by the time the Allies realized the war had already changed shape, the map of Europe had changed with it. Before we go deeper into the documents and orders, subscribe to www.2 Declassified. This channel covers the decisions and delays history books smooth over. By the time Eastern Europe was effectively out of reach, Allied leaders could plausibly claim they had been surprised. What they could not honestly claim was ignorance. The warnings existed. The documents existed. The pattern was visible on paper long before it was acknowledged in policy. They were simply not acted on. Throughout late 1944 and early 1945, intelligence agencies inside the Allied system were producing a steady stream of reports describing Soviet behavior in newly liberated territories. These were not ideological critiques. They were operational observations, arrest lists, administrative replacements, security reorganizations that mirrored Soviet internal control structures rather than temporary wartime measures. Inside American channels, OSS field officers in Poland and the Balkans were among the first to notice the pattern. Their reports described Soviet-backed provisional governments being formed within days of Red Army arrival, often before any genuine coalition could take shape. Communist cadres were placed into key ministries immediately, especially Interior, Police, and Communications. Non-communist allies were given ceremonial roles while real authority consolidated elsewhere. The language of these reports was cautious, but the implications were severe. They warned that Soviet influence was becoming structural, not provisional. Similar cables flowed through British channels. Diplomatic observers in Romania and Bulgaria reported that Soviet military commanders were coordinating directly with local communist parties, bypassing pre-war elites and resistance movements that had expected Allied support. Arrests were framed as security measures. Disappearances were explained as wartime chaos, but the same names kept surfacing across different regions. The machinery was consistent. Inside Allied headquarters, these reports were categorized as political assessments, not military intelligence. That distinction mattered. Military intelligence drove operations. Political assessments were deferred to later conferences, later negotiations, later phases. Later never came. The most revealing documents were not dramatic. They did not use alarmist language. That is precisely why they were dangerous. One internal OSS summary noted that Soviet-backed security services were assuming permanent authority functions in Poland weeks before Germany surrendered. Another British memorandum warned that coalition governments were being hollowed out from within through control of police forces. None of these documents accused Stalin of bad faith directly. They simply described what was happening. And yet, inside Allied planning circles, these files stalled. They conflicted with the dominant strategic priority of the moment, keeping Stalin cooperative until Germany was defeated. Any intelligence that suggested the alliance was already unraveling was treated as inconvenient rather than decisive. This is where the hidden file becomes crucial, not because it was secret, but because it was compartmentalized. Warnings about Soviet political consolidation were kept separate from operational planning. Boundary decisions proceeded as if political outcomes were still fluid. Halt lines were drawn with the assumption that diplomacy could correct whatever emerged afterward. That assumption was never tested honestly. At conferences, Allied leaders relied on assurances rather than evidence. Stalin's statements were weighed more heavily than reports from the ground. When confronted with intelligence indicating aggressive Soviet behavior, the response was often procedural: more talks, more clarification, more patience. Stalin used this to his advantage. He understood that the Western Allies were bound by process. He exploited the lag between observation and response. While intelligence officers wrote cables and diplomats drafted notes, Soviet administrators were already rewriting local power structures. Every day of delay hardened the outcome. What makes this phase so striking is how little Stalin had to hide. His strategy operated in plain sight. He did not deny Soviet involvement. He framed it as security, as stabilization, as a response to the devastation the USSR had suffered. And the Allies accepted that framing because challenging it would require confronting a larger truth: that the alliance had reached its expiration date before the war had officially ended. That was a reality no one wanted to announce. Even when intelligence analysts privately acknowledged the danger, their conclusions were softened as they moved upward. Strong language became cautious phrasing. Predictions became possibilities. Warnings became considerations. By the time reports reached senior decision-makers, urgency had been filtered out. This was not censorship. It was institutional self-protection. Challenging Stalin too early risked splitting the coalition. Splitting the coalition risked prolonging the war. Prolonging the war risked domestic backlash. So the system defaulted to delay. The most damaging aspect of this delay was that it created a false sense of reversibility. Allied leaders believed that political arrangements imposed under wartime conditions could be renegotiated later. They assumed elections would restore balance. They assumed international pressure would moderate Soviet behavior. They assumed the presence of Western troops elsewhere would give them leverage. None of those assumptions accounted for the speed with which the Soviet system neutralized opposition. Once security services were in place, elections were theater. Once opposition leaders were arrested or sidelined, coalitions were fiction. Once administrative control shifted, leverage evaporated. By the time Allied diplomats raised objections, the ground had already been prepared to ignore them. The hidden file, the intelligence that mattered most, did not fail because it was wrong. It failed because it was inconvenient at the wrong moment, and as a result, it never shaped policy when it still could have. By the spring of 1945, the Allies were no longer deciding the future of Eastern Europe. They were documenting it. What remained was a single illusion: that boundaries on paper still mattered more than control on the ground. That illusion would collapse in the next phase. The turning point did not arrive with a single conference or a single signature. It arrived through a sequence of pauses, each justified, each temporary, each fatal. By early 1945, the Western Allies possessed something that history often forgets: time leverage. Their armies were intact, their logistics were dominant, their industrial base was unmatched. They were not racing the Soviets out of desperation. They were choosing to slow down for the sake of coordination. That choice changed everything. The first decisive pause came as Allied planners began enforcing halt lines tied to pre-agreed zones of advance. On paper, these lines were instruments of cooperation, meant to prevent accidental clashes and preserve unity. In practice, they froze Western armies in place, while the Red Army continued moving into a vacuum. The logic sounded responsible. The outcome was irreversible. Inside Allied command, the halt lines were treated as technical measures. Inside Moscow, they were understood as guarantees. Every mile the Red Army advanced while Western forces stopped became a fact that diplomacy would later be asked to legitimize. This is where timing mattered most. When Western units paused, they paused with the intention of resuming movement later. When Soviet units advanced, they advanced with the intention of staying. The asymmetry was not military. It was political. The second turning point came through coordination orders that elevated diplomacy over exploitation. Western commanders were instructed to avoid actions that might complicate post-war arrangements. That phrase, deliberately vague, became a brake on momentum. Opportunities to seize administrative centers, rail hubs, and capitals were deferred in favor of maintaining alignment with agreed plans. Those plans assumed good faith. Stalin did not violate them. He interpreted them. As Western forces respected boundaries not yet enforced, Soviet forces treated absence as permission. They entered cities first, installed provisional authorities, and created security structures that no later negotiation could dismantle without force. The most consequential decisions were not made in combat briefings. They were made in conference rooms. Allied leaders convinced themselves that it was better to finish the war cleanly than to risk friction with the Soviets over territory that could be addressed later. They believed that political settlements could correct military outcomes. They believed that leverage still existed. What they underestimated was how quickly leverage decays once control is established. The third and final turning point came when pauses became normalized. What began as temporary coordination hardened into routine. Each delay made the next one easier to justify. Each acceptance of Soviet security measures made protest harder. By the time objections were raised, they were framed as diplomatic concerns rather than strategic emergencies. At this stage, the Allies were no longer choosing outcomes. They were managing optics. The language shifted accordingly. Soviet actions were described as excesses rather than strategy. Reports were contextualized as understandable given Soviet losses. Urgent intelligence was reframed as long-term concern. This linguistic softening mirrored a strategic retreat. Crucially, none of this required Allied defeat. The Western armies were still winning. Germany was still collapsing. But victory created the illusion that there would be time later to address political consequences. There wasn't. Once Soviet-backed authorities controlled police forces, ministries, and communications, the mechanics of power were locked in. Western diplomats could protest, but they could not reverse facts created under the cover of alliance legitimacy. This is the moment Eastern Europe crossed a line. Not when borders were redrawn, not when elections were staged, but when pause orders transformed temporary presence into permanent control. From that point on, the war's military outcome no longer determined the political map. The map was already being written behind the front lines. The Allies did not lose Eastern Europe in a battle. They lost it by choosing not to contest the moment when contest still mattered. The Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe did not happen through proclamations or treaties. It happened through procedure. While Western leaders debated post-war frameworks, the Soviet Union deployed a machine that required no debate at all. It moved quietly, automatically, and with absolute clarity of purpose. Wherever the Red Army advanced, this machine followed, sometimes within hours, often within minutes. Its components were consistent everywhere. First came the military presence, visible and unquestioned. Red Army units secured key terrain, roads, rail yards, and communication nodes. This part looked familiar to Allied observers. It resembled liberation. The second layer was less visible and far more decisive. NKVD detachments arrived alongside or just behind combat units, not as guests, but as partners. Their task was not counterintelligence against Germans. It was political preparation. They carried lists, names of local officials, resistance leaders, landowners, clergy, police officers, and anyone with influence outside communist structures. These lists were not compiled on the spot. They were prepared in advance. This is where the machine reveals its intent. The Soviet Union did not wait to see what kind of governments might emerge after the war. It pre-selected which people would be allowed to shape the future and which would not. The moment an area was liberated, those decisions were enforced. Local administrations were not dismantled publicly. They were hollowed out. Communist Party members were installed into ministries that mattered: interior, security, transportation, communications. Coalition governments were permitted to exist on paper, but the levers of power were quietly removed from them. Police forces answered to Soviet advisors. Intelligence services were rebuilt under Moscow's supervision. Courts were staffed with compliant figures. By the time Western diplomats arrived, they were often greeted by governments that looked pluralistic but functioned as extensions of Soviet authority. This was not improvisation. It was a playbook. The machine worked because it exploited a fundamental Western assumption that wartime measures were temporary. Soviet actions were framed as security necessities in unstable regions. The language sounded reasonable. The effect was permanent. Western observers often noted arrests and disappearances, but they misread their purpose. They assumed the Soviets were targeting collaborators or criminals. In reality, the targets were future rivals. People who could organize opposition later were removed early, before elections, before international oversight, before public scrutiny. Once that step was complete, everything else followed naturally. Elections could be staged. Coalitions could be announced. Agreements could be signed. None of it mattered once independent power was gone. The speed of this process shocked even some Soviet allies. In several countries, communist parties that had been marginal before the war suddenly controlled entire state apparatuses within months. This was not because of popular support. It was because the machine did not rely on popularity. It relied on control. What made this especially devastating was that it unfolded under the legal cover of the alliance. The Red Army was an allied force. Its movements were legitimate. Its presence was sanctioned. Western leaders had agreed, implicitly and explicitly, that Soviet forces would operate in these regions during the war. Stalin understood the power of that legitimacy. Every administrative change was presented as a local decision made under wartime conditions. Every security measure was justified as preventing chaos. Every arrest was framed as temporary. And because the West had chosen not to confront these actions early, each step built upon the last, without resistance. By the time Allied protests became more direct, the machine had completed its work. To reverse it would have required force. And force was the one thing the Allies were no longer willing to use. This is the critical insight often missed in simplified histories. Eastern Europe did not fall because the Soviets were stronger militarily. It fell because their political machine moved faster than Allied decision-making. The Western Allies had leverage early. They had armies. They had resources. They had moral authority. What they lacked was urgency. They treated political consolidation as a future problem. Stalin treated it as a present mission. Once the machine finished embedding itself, leverage vanished. From that moment on, any attempt to challenge Soviet control would require a new war. And after 6 years of global conflict, no Western leader was prepared to make that choice. The machine had done its job. By the summer of 1945, the Western Allies were no longer asking whether Stalin's actions were acceptable. They were asking a quieter, more consequential question: what could be done without breaking the peace? The answer, increasingly, was nothing. This is where the clampdown took its final form, not against Stalin, but against the conversation about what had already happened. Inside Allied governments, especially in Washington and London, the tone shifted decisively. Intelligence assessments describing Soviet consolidation were no longer circulated as urgent warnings. They were filed as background. Diplomatic cables stopped asking how to reverse events and began asking how to manage them. The language softened on purpose. Soviet actions were described as excessive security measures. Arrests became internal matters. One-party dominance was reframed as transitional instability. Each rewording reduced the political cost of inaction. This was not naivety. It was damage control. Publicly confronting Stalin would require admitting that Allied decisions, halt lines, pauses, deference, had consequences they could not undo. It would also force leaders to explain why armies that had just defeated Nazi Germany were unwilling to contest Soviet expansion without firing a shot. That explanation would not survive contact with exhausted populations, so the narrative changed. Instead of acknowledging that Eastern Europe had been decided during the war, Allied leaders framed the situation as a post-war divergence. The Cold War, they implied, emerged after peace, slowly, unpredictably, as former allies drifted apart. This framing served a purpose. It detached responsibility from wartime decision-making and placed it on an abstract future conflict. Privately, many officials knew better. Diplomats who had served in Eastern Europe understood that leverage was gone. Intelligence officers recognized that the machinery of control had already locked in outcomes. Military planners knew that reversing the situation would require force, on a scale no one was prepared to authorize. But these realities were kept out of public debate. The clampdown extended to history itself. Official summaries emphasized Allied unity. Conference records highlighted agreements rather than their exploitation. The final phase of the war was presented as orderly, coordinated, and mutually respectful. Where disagreements existed, they were portrayed as misunderstandings rather than strategy. This mattered because it shaped how the world understood what followed. If Eastern Europe was lost later, then no one had to explain why it was not contested earlier. If Soviet dominance was the result of post-war betrayal, then wartime decisions could remain unquestioned. The story absolved everyone except the future. Stalin benefited from this narrative without having to enforce it. He did not need propaganda campaigns to justify his gains. The West did that work itself by choosing restraint over reckoning. Every attempt to preserve diplomatic stability reinforced the permanence of Soviet control. By the time Churchill spoke publicly about an Iron Curtain, the curtain had already been welded into place. The clampdown was complete, not through censorship, but through consensus, a shared decision among Allied leaders that reopening the question of Eastern Europe would create more danger than accepting the outcome. This is the moment when history hardened. Not because the Allies approved of what Stalin had done, but because they accepted that undoing it would cost more than they were willing to pay. By the time the Second World War officially ended in Europe, the future of Eastern Europe was no longer undecided. It was simply unacknowledged. The Red Army stood where it stood, Soviet-backed administrations governed where they governed. Security services controlled what they controlled. Nothing about this arrangement was temporary anymore. What followed in the months and years after 1945 did not create Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. It formalized it. Elections, treaties, mutual assistance pacts, and people's republics did not mark the beginning of control. They marked its normalization. This distinction matters because it reveals how the outcome was buried, not through secrecy, but through timing. History was written as if Eastern Europe was lost gradually, through a series of post-war crises, disputed elections, political purges, the Berlin blockade, the Iron Curtain speech, but those were not causes. They were confirmations. The real decisions had already been made. They were made when Western armies paused instead of advancing, when intelligence warnings were filed instead of acted upon, when alliance management was prioritized over leverage. By the time Allied leaders acknowledged that cooperation with Moscow had limits, the window to enforce those limits without war had already closed. This is the buried outcome most post-war histories avoid confronting. Eastern Europe was not surrendered in a single agreement. It was allowed to slip away through a sequence of reasonable choices that, taken together, became irreversible. And because none of those choices looked catastrophic in isolation, no one was held responsible for the result. That is why the story had to be reframed. If Eastern Europe fell later, then no one failed earlier. If the Cold War began after peace, then wartime decisions could remain unquestioned. This framing protected leaders, preserved unity, and avoided uncomfortable questions about whether the war's end could have been shaped differently. But the documents tell a different story. They show that Soviet political control followed the Red Army immediately. They show that Allied intelligence recognized the pattern early. They show that halt lines and pauses mattered far more than conferences. Most importantly, they show that by the time Germany surrendered, the strategic balance in Europe had already been decided. The Allies did not lose Eastern Europe because they were weak. They lost it because they believed time was on their side, when it wasn't. Stalin understood something his partners did not. Wars end in phases, and the phase after collapse belongs to whoever acts fastest. He did not need another invasion. He did not need to violate agreements openly. He only needed to move while others waited, and they did. That is the quiet truth behind the map that emerged after 1945. Not a sudden betrayal, not an unexpected shift, but the predictable result of hesitation at the only moment when hesitation still mattered. If you want World War II history stripped of ceremony and rebuilt from documents, decisions, and consequences, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. This channel covers the moments history books smooth over, the pauses, the compromises, and the choices that shaped the world that followed. More Declassified episodes are coming next.